drawn that particular slip of paper, and I knew she would. Davy had previously tried to conceal his enthusiasm, but we knew he had his heart set on a tour of Illinois. Our time was limited, however, and we couldn't possibly cover the entire state. There's a lot to see, from Waukegan to Cairo, Danville to Quincy, lakes, beaches, the great state parks and historic memorials. Metropolitan Chicago is a vacation in itself. So, where would we start? What would we see? As it turned out, Davy had arranged all that, too. He'd obviously spent a lot of time on the project, had already worked out the whole itinerary, his own historical tour of Illinois. All in all, it turned out to be a great experience for us, particularly for Peg and myself. We've lived in the state a long time, but this was the first time we really got to see Illinois and enjoy it as we never had before, a boy. We started off bright and early that night. Not exactly on schedule, of course. Nobody ever gets away on time when a trip is planned. You know how it goes. Is the stove turned off? Are the doors locked? Did you call the newspaper, the milkman, and so on and so on? Anyway, an hour or so later, we were headed northwest on Highway 20, through Rockford and the countryside that once had heard the rumble and rattle of the old stagecoach from Chicago to Galena. The line had closed down many, many years ago, but it was still operating in a boy's imagination. I knew he was seeing it all as it had been in the past, hearing it too, the pound whip. Galena has been called the town that time forgot. Well over a century ago, Galena was a thriving, bustling little metropolis, center of a lead and zinc mining industry, its river choked with traffic from the upper Mississippi. And Chicago was only a swamp village. Now, Galena sits in quiet dignity, a mirror reflecting an exciting and turbulent era our nation's past. It's a shrine-dotted town, proud of its mementos, its identification with days gone by. The Market House, for example, oldest in the Midwest, where businessmen of earlier days traded in lead, zinc, and grain. Famed Hotel de Soto, first opened in April 1855, the center of social activity where Lincoln spoke and Jenny Lind sang. Some of the oldest churches in Illinois. Gracious century-old mansions that cling to the hillside. Here, a then unknown ex-soldier came to live with his wife and family in the spring of 1860, to walk this quiet street and down these stairs to and from his home and the store where he worked. Until a day in April of '61. And here at the county courthouse on that April day, that ex-soldier, Ulysses S. Grant, offered his services when President Lincoln called for volunteers to save the Union. The heroes, dead and living, returned to be mourned, to be cheered. 10,000 strong greeted General Grant, the military hero of the day, as he returned to live in the home given him by the town's grateful citizens. The original furnishings still remain, and today the home is maintained exactly as it was during the occupancy of the Grant family. And it was from this quiet, happy retreat that he once more took his leave of Galena to serve his country, to assume the highest office in the land when he was elected president in 1868. I had hoped to halt for a coffee break before leaving Galena, but no, that didn't fit into Davy's timetable. So we continued south toward Rock Island and Moline. I watched Davy stand on the bank of the Rock River in Indian country and gaze across to the opposite shore. And I knew the picture that was forming in his thoughts. Yes, like Davy, I felt a presence there. Someone on the opposite shore. Watchful eyes. Someone there, too, watching, waiting. The slight rustle of leaves. Is it only the wind? Here on the shore of the Rock River, where once stood the principal settlements of the Sauk and Fox Nation, the famed warrior Chief Black Hawk was born almost 2 centuries ago. High on the bluff of what is now Black Hawk Park, he stood and watched with mounting resentment the westward moving white men take over his tribal lands, until his anger flamed in open war, the war that bears his name. Today, in the Park Museum, you can see bark teepees and relics of those Indian days. It had been Davy's suggestion, and Peg and I had readily agreed, that the best way to enjoy and appreciate the places we intended to visit was to do some reading about them first. So we'd made it a practice to do just that every noon. After lunch, that is. I figured I'd better eat while I had the chance. I'd learned it didn't pay to interfere with that boy's timetable. Jubilee College, whose doors were first opened in 1840, was one of the earliest educational enterprises in the state. Set in tranquil woods northwest of Peoria, it remains as a fitting memorial to clergymen of all faiths who kept pace with explorers and pioneers moving west. Just of Lewistown, in picturesque Spoon River Valley, is Dixon Mounds, burial place of an ancient civilization. Pre-white Americans, probably of Asiatic origin. They are believed to have crossed over into the American continent by the Bering Straits. After death, each body was laid upon the surface of the hill and covered with soil, and so great mounds were built. Metamora Courthouse was the home of the old 8th Circuit Court in the hearty 1840s and 50s, when lawyers traveled in buggies and on horseback from one county seat to another. And among the most popular of the circuit riding lawyers who practiced here were Stephen A. Douglas, Robert Ingersoll, and Abe Lincoln. Lincoln's spirit lives eternally in Illinois, and here in New Salem, where he spent his formative years, he stands at your side. Moving down the Sangamon River in 1831, young Lincoln caught his first glimpse of New Salem. It was here, at the old saw and grist mill, that his river flatboat stranded. Thus introducing him to the village which was to become his home for the next 6 years. It was here that he clerked in a store, embarked upon his own ill-fated business venture, served as postmaster, and studied law by the light of burning shavings in the fireplace of Henry Onstott's cooperage. And it was here in New Salem that young Abe Lincoln drilled with other volunteers before leaving to fight in the Black Hawk War. Joshua Miller, village blacksmith, and Jack Kelso, trapper, philosopher, built this double house in 1832. And it was in Jack Kelso's cabin that Abe Lincoln first became acquainted with the classics of literature. One of the most interesting features at New Salem is the carding mill and wool house. Power for the double carder was furnished by 2 oxen treading the big wheel at the rear of the building. Here, Lincoln operated a store with William Berry, only to fail and go into debt. Famed Rutledge Tavern was the first cabin in the village. When Abe Lincoln boarded here, he slept in the loft. It was from New Salem that he was first elected to the legislature. A raw-boned young man left, safely embarked upon a career of law and statesmanship, rising to the presidency in one of the most critical periods of our nation's history. Springfield, home and final resting place of Abraham Lincoln. Springfield was selected as the state capital in 1837, mainly through Mr. Lincoln's efforts. There he served in the legislature and gained fame as a lawyer. He watched the governor's mansion go up and attended parties in its rooms. A few blocks away, Lincoln and his family lived in the only home he ever owned. Its rooms still reflect memories of his. Here in this gracious, comfortable home, 3 of Lincoln's sons were born. And here he was first notified of his election to the presidency of the United States. Of his beloved Springfield, the newly elected president said in his farewell, "To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return." A few hours' drive from Springfield, and we found ourselves in Pere Marquette State Park. Named for the famed missionary priest, this beautiful recreational area is located just north of Alton. Davy's horseshoe game turned out to be a trifle rusty. Mine, I must admit, wasn't much better, but it didn't matter. We were all having a whale of a time on our Illinois holiday. Peg and I were getting a special kick out of it because we knew how much the trip meant to Davy, and we were happy it had turned out this way. We were certain that he would have been keenly disappointed had Peg drawn a different slip of paper out of the glass jar back home. A slip of paper that would have sent us somewhere else on our vacation. It is thought that prehistoric Americans lived here, nomads, hunters, probably appearing in this wide valley around the beginning of the Christian era. But it was not until an autumn day in 1673 that recorded history of Illinois began, with the arrival of the first white man known to have set foot on Illinois soil. Leaving the Mississippi, Father Marquette, Louis Joliet, and 5 companions turned their canoes up the Illinois River, and an unending procession of others were to follow. Hennepin, LaSalle, Tonte, to govern, develop the region, pushing up the strategic waterway to establish forts and settlements. One of the important early posts was Fort Deschartres along the Mississippi, south of St. Louis. King Louis XV of France ordered the great fortification built in the early 1700s. And for more than 50 years, this was the civil and military seat of government in the Illinois country. The original powder house dates back over 2 centuries. But France was defeated elsewhere, in Canada, and her dominion in America was doomed. By 1763, King Louis ceded the Illinois country to Britain in the Treaty of Paris, and 2 years later, the fleur-de-lis was lowered for the last time. The end of an era. But today, Fort Deschartres remains a symbol of that colorful chapter of Illinois history we know as the French regime, when French soldiers and explorers, priests and traders probed our forests and roamed our prairies, and French settlers created villages resembling those of the mother country: Peoria, Cahokia, Prairie du Rocher, Kaskaskia. The home of Pere Menard, Illinois' first lieutenant governor, overlooks the area that once was Kaskaskia, the commercial queen of the West, and the first territorial and state capital of Illinois. Kaskaskia itself has vanished, created and destroyed by the same force, the Mississippi. After a disastrous flood in 1844, the river cut a new channel, leaving the town an island. Then, slowly, year by year, the Mississippi ate into the island, gnawed its way into the village, gathered up house after house. Part of the old village was here. The rest of it lies here and here. Founded by the French in 1703, the town, just south of Fort Deschartres, passed into British hands in 1765. Then, on a 4th of July night in 1778, the sound of this Liberty Bell of the West carried across the countryside when George Rogers Clark and his Kentucky Long Knives took the town from the British and claimed it for America. But time and the Mississippi had a rendezvous with Kaskaskia. In 1820, the state capital was moved to Vandailia, where Abe Lincoln served as one of Sangamon County's representatives. Enacted in the legislature here were the first school laws of Illinois, and the act incorporating a rather small town of that period, a town called Chicago. Starved Rock State Park, near LaSalle, Ottawa, and Peru, was the first center of French influence in Illinois. It was one of the principal Indian villages and the arena of savage warfare. According to legend, part of the Illinois tribe was besieged atop the rock by Potawatomis, starved into submission and annihilated. Today, the park is a vacation area of scenic beauty and historic memories. It had been a great trip, and the credit had to go to Davy, the way he had arranged it all, right from when he'd suggested we draw a slip of paper from the glass jar and let the fates decide where we would go. But you know, I got to wondering about that. He'd put in a lot of time and effort planning our trip through Illinois, all on the slim hope that the right slip of paper would be drawn. Yes, I'd gotten a little curious. Call it a hunch, but I felt it was worth looking into. Into the glass jar, I mean. You know, I'd have done the same thing.